The NFL is by far the most popular and successful sports league in the United States, generating an estimated $20 billion in revenue last year. That's 70% higher than what the NBA and Major League Baseball made. The average value of an NFL franchise is $6.5 billion. The NFL is pretty much printing money at this point. But things weren't always so rosy and profitable. The NFL went through a long period of financial struggles during its early stages. Let's take a closer look on the humble beginnings of the NFL and how it became the money-making machine it is today. American football can trace its roots back to rugby and soccer, and early versions of the game were very different from the football we know today. The first official game of American football was played in 1869 between Rutgers and Princeton, even though it probably looked more like a rugby match than a current-day football game. The teams were composed of 25 players on each side. Carrying or throwing the ball was not allowed. Kicking the ball or batting it with one's hands, knees, or heads was the only way to move the ball around the field. The goal was to kick a ball into an opponent's goal area to score points. In 1880, Walter Camp, who's considered the father of American football, proposed a set of rules that would make the game more structured and safe, including downs, line of scrimmage, and 11 players on each side. His rules helped shape the game we know today. In the late 1800s, football was dominated by the Ivy League schools, until the early 1900s, when football began to gain popularity at other colleges and universities across the country. In the late 1800s, there were some amateur football clubs that started to pop up, which led to several smaller regional football leagues. American football became a professional sport in the 1890s when some of these independent football clubs started paying their players. Some of the early regional football leagues were the Western Pennsylvania Professional Football Circuit, the Ohio League, and the New York Football League. American football during this time was extremely brutal, and many people pushed for the sport to be banned. In 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt met with coaches to come up with rule changes to make the game safer. The forward pass was one of these rule changes and was adopted in 1906, though there was a 15-yard penalty for an incomplete pass and a turnover if the intended receiver didn't touch the ball. During this time, many college players would play for their college teams while accepting payment to play in occasional professional games. There were no long-term contracts like there is today, just a lot of handshake deals to play individual seasons or games. Team owners would try to poach the better players from other teams, which created intense bidding wars. There wasn't a lot of structure and rules, and due to soaring player salaries, the owners were bleeding cash. The owners of these pro teams coveted a strong league, such as one baseball had, in order to gain more control over the sport and, more importantly, the finances. In August of 1920, one of these owners, Ralph Hay, the owner of the Ohio League champions, the Canton Bulldogs, had invited representatives of other teams from the Ohio League and New York Football League to meet in order to hammer out a deal on a new and stronger association. The goal of the new venture was to raise the standard of professional football in every way possible, to eliminate bidding for players between rival clubs, and to secure cooperation in the formation of schedules. A month later, a deal was struck, and on September 17, 1920, in Ralph Hay's auto dealership showroom in Canton, Ohio, representatives from professional football clubs from Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and New York hammered out the agreement. The new league would be called the American Professional Football Association. The name would be changed to the National Football League, or NFL, 2 years later. The new league needed a president and league face, which was a decision that required little debate amongst the owners. The team reps selected 32-year-old Jim Thorpe, who played for the Canton Bulldogs at the time, and the former gold medal winner in both the pentathlon and decathlon, was considered the world's greatest athlete. The selection of Thorpe allowed the new league to get a little bit more press in the papers. The original teams of the APFA, or NFL, were the Akron Pros, who won the first championship in 1920, and due to financial reasons, they suspended operations in 1927 and formally surrendered its franchise the following year. The Canton Bulldogs, who saw some early success by winning back-to-back NFL championships in 1922 and 1923, but the franchise didn't survive either, with the 1926 season being its last. There were the Cleveland Tigers, who changed their name in 1921 to the Cleveland Indians, since they shared a field with the Cleveland Indians baseball team. The team folded after the 1921 season, though professional football did eventually come back to Cleveland. The Dayton Triangles, named after the park they played in and the site of the first NFL game, Triangle Park. The Triangles were one of only 3 original NFL teams to survive the 1920s, but surviving wasn't easy. It became apparent that Dayton was not big enough to support a team, so the Triangles pretty much became a traveling team, playing most of the games on the road. At the time, each team handled their own scheduling, making this possible. By the late 20s, the team became one of the league's doormats, and only revenue from playing on the road kept them afloat. They were sold in 1930 and moved to Brooklyn and became the Brooklyn Dodgers. Several early NFL teams adopted the same name as the local baseball teams. There were the Decatur Staleys, which started out as an industrial team with workers from Staley Manufacturing before they turned semi-pro and then fully professional. The owner of the team, A.E. Staley, turned the franchise over to player-coach George Halas, who moved the team to Wrigley Field in Chicago. Staley paid Halas $5,000 to keep the name Staley's for 1 more year. After that, Halas changed their name to the Chicago Bears, since they shared a field with the Cubs baseball team, and Bears are bigger than Cubs. The Bears have been an NFL fixture ever since. There was also the Hammond Pros and Muncie Flyers. Neither team had adequate home stadiums, so they both were pretty much traveling teams. Neither lasted long in the league, with the Flyers lasting 2 seasons and the Pros lasting until 1926. There were the Rochester Jeffersons, who struggled to draw crowds, and the team lost a lot of money to the point that owner Leo Lyons had to foreclose on his house after putting all his assets into the team. It wasn't easy being an NFL owner back in these days. Out of all the original NFL teams, I feel they had the nicest jerseys. Maybe that's where all the money went. The Jeffersons suspended operations in 1925. There were the Rock Island Independents, who left the NFL in 1926 to become a charter member of the American Football League, but folded along with the league the following year. The Independents' departure was due to declining attendance and financial difficulties. At the time, college football dominated the football landscape in the U.S., and it was hard for professional football to gain traction, especially for teams in smaller communities. There were the Racine Cardinals, who are the oldest NFL franchise and who are now the current-day Arizona Cardinals. The team was originally called the Morgan Athletic Club, a neighborhood team founded in 1898 by painting contractor Chris O'Brien. In 1901, O'Brien bought used jerseys from the University of Chicago that had faded to a cardinal red color, so he renamed the team the Racine Street Cardinals. In 1922, they changed their name to the Chicago Cardinals. They moved to St. Louis in 1950, and then to Arizona in 1999. The Cardinals and Bears, 2 Chicago teams, are the only 2 teams that were at the original meeting in Ralph Hayes Auto Dealership to still be in existence today. During the early years of the NFL, there wasn't a set schedule. Teams were in charge of their own schedules and each played different amount of games, and some played games against teams outside of the NFL. It wasn't until 1936, the league's 16th season, in which all the teams played the same amount of games. This allowed 4 more teams to join the league at different points during the inaugural season. The Buffalo All-Americans, the Chicago Tigers, the Columbus Panhandles, and the Detroit Heralds. The Tigers and Heralds both disbanded by the end of the first season, and the Buffalo All-Americans didn't make it out of the 20s, but professional football would eventually return to Buffalo. The Panhandles, a club formed in the early 1900s by workers at the Panhandle shops of the Pennsylvania Railroad, joined the league right before the start of the first season and are credited with playing in the first NFL game against the Dayton Triangles. The club consisted of railroad workers, mainly European immigrants, who learned the game not on college gridirons like most players in the league, but on the sandlots of railroad yards during their lunch breaks, and were considered one of the toughest teams of the era. The team folded in 1922 because of rising costs, but the Panhandle's team manager, Joe Carr, became the league president after the 1920 season, replacing Jim Thorpe. Carr, who would serve as league president until his death in 1939, helping navigate the fragile league through its most difficult times. Called the father of professional football, Carr was one of the 17 inaugural inductees into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1963. There were a lot of franchises that entered the NFL during the 1920s and 30s, but most didn't make it, showing how hard it was to maintain a successful franchise during this period. But the ones that did survive became iconic franchises. The Green Bay Packers entered the NFL during its second season in 1921, and the New York Giants in 1925, who were awarded to Tim Mara and Billy Gibson for $500. Between the Great Depression, operating in smaller markets, and competing against the already well-established and vastly more popular college game that was already deeply ingrained in American culture, made it very difficult for most of these early NFL franchises to survive. The league, under Joe Carr's guidance, slowly started to shift from industrial towns in the Midwest to some of the bigger East Coast markets. Signing some of the bigger college stars of the time, especially Red Grange, was crucial and helped with league popularity and credibility and kept the league going during this early period. In 1933, the NFL, who had long followed the rules of college football, made a number of significant changes from the college game. One rule change was that a pass could be made from anywhere behind the line of scrimmage. Prior to this, you had to be at least 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage to make a pass. That change provided a big lift to the passing attacks, which boosted scoring and differentiated NFL play from the college game. They also divided the league into 2 divisions, with the winners of each division meeting in an annual championship game, with George Halas's Bears defeating my New York Giants in Wrigley Field on December 17, 1933. Before this, the team with the highest win percentage would be the champion. That same year, 2 teams from Pennsylvania joined the league, the Pittsburgh Pirates, who would become the Steelers, and the Philadelphia Eagles. Given how Pennsylvania was an early football hotspot, it's surprising how long it took for teams from the state to enter the NFL. In the 1939 season, league attendance surpassed 1 million for the first time, but the league still struggled to keep its head above water going into the 40s, especially with many of its players and coaches going to fight in World War II. Due to depleted rosters, there were shortened seasons, and some teams actually merged during the war. The 2 Pennsylvania teams, the Steelers and the Eagles, merged for the 1943 season. The NFL finally started to take off in the late 1950s with the help of nationally televised broadcast games, especially after the 1958 championship game between the Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants, which was nicknamed the greatest game ever played. In 1960, the NFL faced a new challenge, a rival league called the AFL, who, with the help of a lucrative TV contract, started signing the top college talent to larger contracts. The fierce competition to sign players caused player salaries to skyrocket. The 2 leagues agreed to a merger in 1966. Among the merger conditions were a common draft and a championship game played between the 2 league champions, first played in 1967, which would eventually become known as the Super Bowl. After the merger, the league continued to grow to become the most popular sport in the U.S., replacing baseball as the country's favorite pastime, and turned itself into the money-making behemoth it is today. Thanks for watching. As always, I appreciate it. Please subscribe for more historical videos. Take care.